Although it was quite clear from the start that Lewis would one day become a writer, it was far from clear that he would one day become a Christian. He'd been an atheist, a serious one, for most of his early life. One of the reasons the BBC asked him to give the series of radio talks that became Mere Christianity was because, as Lewis put it, he still remembered what Christianity looked like from the outside to people who were not Christians. When he was 17, Lewis summarized his religious views in a letter to Arthur Greeves, a friend he'd known since childhood.
I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best.
15 years later, he would write to Arthur expressing a very different conviction.
Christianity is God expressing himself through what we call real things, namely the actual incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection.
Lewis's great change did not include a dramatic Damascus Road experience. It took Lewis all of that 15 years and a great deal of truthful self-reflection and careful thinking to change his mind. In 1917, when Lewis arrived here in Oxford, he was a student who believed in no religion. The college he attended was largely agnostic or atheistic, and so the young Lewis fit in well with the post-Christian, even anti-Christian atmosphere. This is the quad of University College, or UNIV as it's called. Right up there someplace is where an 18-year-old named Clive Staples Lewis lived when he was a student here. Years later, after his books were widely read on both sides of the Atlantic, Lewis began receiving requests to recount the story of his spiritual journey. People wanted to know how he'd gone from being a committed skeptic to a committed Christian. In response to these appeals, he wrote Surprised by Joy, the story of his life up to his conversion. Now, the title, Surprised by Joy, came from Lewis's own description of the mysterious longing he experienced for something more than he was. Even as an atheist, he felt an unsatisfied desire that was more desirable, as he put it, than any satisfaction. Lewis called this strange desire joy, always spelled with a capital J. This special feeling of joy would come and go sporadically. At times he felt it consistently, other times it would disappear for long periods. But when it did come, its presence was always fleeting, yet these momentary experiences always left him with a sense of something wonderful that lay just beyond his grasp. As a serious atheist, Lewis was not surprised by the joy he experienced, he was shocked by it. It made no sense to him that if, as he believed, there was nothing beyond nature, nothing beyond what he could see, touch, taste, and smell, then where did this longing come from? And why did it seem that nothing in this world could satisfy it?
Nearly all I loved I believed to be imagery. Nearly all that I believed to be real I thought grim and meaningless. I was, at this time, living like so many atheists, in a whirl of contradictions.
A thoroughgoing theist who felt an unearthly longing. This paradox would lead Lewis to ask serious questions about what he thought was real and what he took to be imaginary, and to look for serious answers. In this session, we'll explore what Lewis found when he, as a thoroughgoing atheist, asked the question, what lies behind the law of nature, behind the sense of right and wrong that we all share?
C.S. Lewis recognized that we lived in a world full of contingencies. If you see a toddler, you could presuppose that somewhere there were parents that produced that child. If you see a building, you can understand that there were architects and contractors and laborers who built the building. All of those things are contingent upon other things that were there prior. Lewis recognized then that in this universe, there must be something that's outside of the processes of contingencies, something that is necessary and eternal. But what would that be? And in Mere Christianity, Lewis deduces that there are at least two different approaches to this. One is a materialist approach, and the other is what he calls a religious approach or supernatural approach. The materialist approach believes that matter is eternal. It's always been there. It's something all of us were taught even in middle school. Matter is neither created nor destroyed, and we were fed at that time a particular worldview. But if in fact matter is eternal, the question comes, well, where do ideas come from? Where does justice come from? Where does a sense of love come from? You've never had a meaningful discussion with a rock. But the materialist says, oh, no, we can explain it all. The lovers don't really love each other. The man looks at a woman. Her image is projected on the retina of his eye through a series of electrical synapses. It travels along the optic nerve, stimulates the brain, causes secretion of particular hormones. And he says it's love, but the materialist says, no, it's not love. It's just matter, just chemistry. The problem is Lewis had bought that view when he was an atheist. It was a worldview that supported him in his atheism. But one day he saw the inherent contradiction. For you see, the materialist looks at the lovers and they project an image on his retina. A message travels along his optic nerve and stimulates his brain and causes secretion of particular hormones, and he calls it explanation. But he wants you to believe his explanation is valid even though the lovers can't really say love. And Lewis, in seeing the contradiction, came to the conclusion, he writes about it in Miracles, that I do not believe reason is mere cerebral biochemistry. And he rejected the materialist view. By contrast, there was the religious or supernaturalist view, that in fact the things that we see that are contingent in this world had their source from something that was not material, was ultimately immaterial, that is, was from God. Now, the scientists, Lewis understands, can tell us some things about this material world, but they have limitations. While the scientists can give us many good insights, there are some things they can't really talk about in a substantive way. John Polkinghorne, the Cambridge physicist, once said, if you ask the scientists, why is the kettle boiling? The scientists will give you an answer, and it will be heat from the burner is agitating the molecules of the water and causing the kettle to boil at 212 degrees at sea level. But Polkinghorne said, you could also say, the kettle's boiling because I wanted a pot of tea, and would you like a cup of tea also? Now that second answer is equally valid, but it's not an answer the scientists could get you to because they work with the quantifiable. They work with the measurable. And our world is far more complex, and that can be reduced merely to the quantifiable and measurable. Years ago, I had an astrophysicist tell me that she lived by the principle, if she couldn't perceive it empirically, she just didn't believe it. And I said to her, well, could you set that principle forth for me empirically? And of course she couldn't. And in the moment that she had to admit that she couldn't, she saw the contradiction in her own principle. She had been an atheist, but after our conversation, she became an agnostic because she saw the problem. Lewis also saw the problem. Now, he believed that we can know, but the way that we know is interesting, and especially about religious truth. Ultimately, it comes from authority or revelation. As a matter of fact, before Lewis was a Christian, he was thinking about these matters, and he's reasoned his way through atheism, it's supporting materialism, agnosticism, and finally he becomes a theist. But at that point in his life, and surprised by joy, his autobiography, he said he didn't think he could know God personally any more than Hamlet could know Shakespeare. A year and a half later, C.S. Lewis became a Christian. And he realized that his image of Hamlet and Shakespeare was in fact a good one. For you see, Hamlet, the character of the play, could never break out of the play to get to know the author, Shakespeare. But in fact, Shakespeare, the author, could have written himself into the play as Shakespeare, the character, and made the introduction possible. And Lewis said, that's what I believe happened in the Incarnation. When God wrote himself into the play of human experience and made himself known to us through his Son. Now, Lewis said we also have insider information. All of us have a sense of morality. We all sense what is fair play. We may not always see when we violate that, but if somebody around us violates it, we're quick to point it out right away. And if somebody accuses us of violating it, we're quick to make excuses and rationalizations for these things. Now, as Lewis writes about this, we see that he writes about it with great humility. Lewis isn't quick to point out the sins and shortcomings of others, but he does believe that if we're going to deal honestly with life, we have to deal with these shortcomings. And Lewis says one of the best ways to get people to do it is just to be honest about it ourselves. I suppose I could put it in context by telling a story. Years ago, I was asked to give an evensong service at Hartford College at Oxford University. The chaplain, a friend, invited me to sit at high table with the faculty after the meal was over. High table at Oxford University is fabulous. If you've ever seen the Harry Potter movies, the hall where they have their meals is the hall at Christ Church, one of the Oxford University halls. It's the most spectacular, of course. Hartford's not quite as grand, but it's not bad. Long tables run the length of the hall. Perpendicular to them and elevated about 2 or 3 steps is the high table where the faculty sit. If the students are eating roast beef, the faculty are eating prime rib. If the students are eating steak, the faculty are eating filet mignon. Everybody eats the high table meal in their academic gowns. The meal begins with a Latin prayer. The wine flows freely, and you could cut the pretense with a knife. It's not so bad if you don't take yourself too seriously, but in that environment, many people take themselves far too seriously. The chaplain introduced me as having spoken the evensong service, the Latin prayer. We all sit down. The woman who taught history there was sitting across from me, and she said, "So Jerry, why are you a Christian?" I thought she was asking because she wanted to know. But this insider information must keep us engaged honestly with the material. And I looked at her and I said, I'm a Christian because I'm aware of failure in my life. I'm aware of incongruity. I believe in the high ideal of love. There are these deep convictions that we all have within. I believe in the high ideal of love, but I've had sharp words with people I say I love most in the world. I believe in justice, I said, but there have been times I've been unfair in my treatment of others. I didn't set out to be unfair, but I realize in retrospect I had been. And I don't think I could make it in life, I said to this woman, if I didn't know there was such a thing called forgiveness. Who has ever lived one moment of honest life without the realization that we need to be forgiven? And also I said I became a Christian because I was overwhelmed by the message of God's love, which is an unconditional love, freely given. It's ontological. That means it can't be improved by my well-doing, nor diminished by my poor-doing. So consequently, I said that love that is freely given makes it possible not only for me to come to God for forgiveness, but also out of that love to go and ask forgiveness of the people I might have hurt. And I said, that's why I'm a Christian. The woman was taken back by that answer. She said, well, I can appreciate that, but that's just not my issue. I said, I think I understand what you're saying. I didn't become a Christian till I was in my first year of university. And I said, but I didn't become perfect overnight. That took 2 or 3 weeks before that happened. And as soon as I said that, the entire high table of all the faculty busted up in gut-wrenching laughter. When the laughter subsided, I looked at the woman and I said, your laughter just betrayed you. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, you and I just met, so you don't know the specifics in my life that made that statement that I'd achieved perfection nonsense. But either your read of history or your read of your own life has told you that nobody has it together. And so consequently, this brokenness, this insider information keeps us mindful of the fact that we need more. And I said, in knowing what you know about yourself, what gets you by? She says, I have faith in humanity. I said, I'm interested in anything that's going to help me, but let me ask you about your faith in humanity. Have you ever been wounded by another human being before? She said, of course. I said, have you ever wounded another human being before? She said, I suppose so. She was a little softer on herself. I said, given the fact that we live in such a broken world, how does this faith in humanity work then? And just then, the man sitting next to her who taught French there said, "How does it work for Christians?" And we spent the rest of the dinner engaging in the themes of the grace of God and the forgiveness of God and the love of God, the very kinds of themes that Lewis, building his speculation about natural law, then develops throughout the rest of Mere Christianity. So what does this all mean for us? Lewis's interest in the natural law and how it drove him to faith. I would suggest to you, for Lewis, it brought him to the place of humility, where he realized that he couldn't live up to the standards that he had set for himself, but he also realized that there was a God of grace who made available forgiveness, who loved him in spite of what he did or didn't do, and consequently that love gave him the freedom to fail, which is the freedom to grow. And also, I would suggest to you, there was a humility that came to him, a gratitude that came to him, a magnanimity that came to him, whereby the generosity he had received from God, he was willing to extend to others in his world. And it becomes quite a model for us.
After graduating from Oxford, the young Jack Lewis stayed on at the world's most prestigious university, not as a student, but now as a don, a tutor. On June 25th, 1925, he was formally admitted as a fellow here at Magdalen College, named after Mary Magdalene, but keeping its Middle English pronunciation of Magdalen. Lewis was 26. "It is a formidable ceremony," he wrote to his father, "and not entirely to my taste." Being one of the largest of the colleges at Oxford, Magdalen had a sizable faculty. As part of the admissions ritual, Jack was required to stand in front of them all while the college vice president addressed him for 5 minutes in Latin. At the end of this exhortation, Lewis was required to kneel on a red cushion which had been especially provided for the event. That done, the vice president took Jack by the hand and raised him to his feet with the words, "I wish you joy." Jack tripped a little on his gown while rising, but he took consolation that at least the ceremony was over, or so he thought. Instead, he was sent around the room where each of the fellow dons shook his hand and repeated the same phrase, "I wish you joy." What Jack could not have foreseen was how soon this wish would come true, albeit in a way he never could have expected. Lewis became friends with a wide variety of the faculty. Many were believers, including J.R.R. Tolkien. Lewis intended to influence them with his skepticism, but to his surprise, they began to influence him. Through these friends, Lewis came to see Christianity as intellectually credible, and despite his great desire to be left alone by God, if God existed, a great change took place in him. Understanding that we all have a sense of right and wrong, and that there must be something or someone real behind this universal experience was a pivotal first step for Lewis. It would not be his last. In our next session, we'll explore Christianity's shocking alternative explanation for the universe and our place in it.